Welcome to your lesson on language development. We're going to be looking at a variety of things related to language today, including what is language, where does it come from, which looks at theoretical underpinnings, the developmental progression of language development, as well as language diversity. So as you know by now, I like to start things off with a definition so we're clear on what we're talking about. So what is language? Language is any system of communication. It can be written, such as hieroglyphics. It can be spoken or verbal communication. It can be signed, as in American Sign Language. It's a system of communication that is based upon symbols. Now, for today, we will be focusing on spoken language. So before we begin, there's some terminology we need to understand. Because in order to understand and use language effectively, children need to master 4 different components of language. The first one is phonology. So phonology is looking at the basic sounds that we use to comprise words that make up language. So as you can see here, some examples of the vowel phonemes that you might be going over with your students if you're working on early reading skills. So obviously that's an important part, so they can make the appropriate sounds necessary to communicate. Another important part to master English language is syntax. So syntax is looking at the rules that govern how words go together in order to make proper language. So this is knowing how words can be legitimately combined to make understandable phrases and sentences. For instance, I thought this cartoon was obviously related. It said, words down, got, we've good pretty, should now invent we syntax. So they have the words, they know how to say the words, but it's not in the right order to make sense. That's where syntax comes in. I think it's also important to note that syntax can differ in different languages. Any of you that have picked up a second language, I'm sure, have noticed this. For instance, in English, we would say, oh, there's a red car. The adjective comes first, it's followed by the noun, the blue bird, the green book. But for instance, in French as well as in Spanish, you would say opposite. So in French, you would say la voiture rouge. The noun would come first, followed by the adjective. So syntax rules aren't always the same, which is why learning a second language can be challenging. So what else? I said there were 4 components. The third one is semantics. Semantics is looking at what does the word itself mean. I thought the meme below was somewhat related because you can see those words all look very similar. But semantics is where you learn that through is different than tough, which is different than thorough, which is different than thought, which is different than though, even though they all look similar. So some examples of semantics. I'll just give you a second to look at these. I certainly like the one on ignorance and apathy. I don't know and I don't care. Certainly shows she understands what they mean. All right, so the 4th component that is necessary for mastering language is pragmatics. Pragmatics I find the most interesting. So these are the social conventions that we use, or shall we say the language etiquette, when we are engaged in verbal interactions with another person. Pragmatics allow for effective communication, and they're also indicative of social skills as well. So some examples for pragmatics: knowing how to start a conversation with someone as well as knowing how to end it so it just doesn't linger on and on. Understanding that you need to take turns in a conversation, how to tell a story, how to change a topic if you don't like the particular topic or need to talk about something different, how to argue and say things like hello and goodbye. Our example down below, how to not talk so much. So pragmatics is certainly related to social skills and helps one effectively use their language. So here's another pragmatics example of how pragmatics can vary by culture. In the United States, children are taught to use eye contact when talking with someone. In fact, I can't tell you the number of times I've heard my husband say to our daughter, I need to see your eyes, look me in the eye when you're talking with me. However, in Japan, children are taught to look at the teacher's neck or to look at their tie if they're a male teacher. And as adults, Japanese will lower their eyes when speaking to a superior as a gesture of respect. So it's actually considered disrespectful to look someone right in the eye if they're considered to be a superior or an elder. So again, it's important to know these cultural differences. So if you have a student from another culture who isn't making eye contact with you, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're being disrespectful. Okay, so we're going to be looking at some theories related to the development and acquisition of language. Let's start with Jean Piaget. As we know, he's the father of child development. As a cognitive psychologist, he also studied language. To Piaget, language was part of our symbolic thought, our ability to use a word to represent an object or an event. That a child learns to use the word bottle to represent that they are hungry and that they want milk, for instance. Piaget also felt that language was important for social relationships and that once children acquire language, their relationships with their caregivers improve because the child's able to express their wants and needs. He also felt that language was one of the ways by which children become more logical in their thinking as they progress through his stages, their ability to think in their head, and it also helped them to become less egocentric. And recall, egocentrism is where you are kind of stuck in your own head and unable to put yourself in someone else's shoes. So language helps you in those two aspects of cognitive development. Then we have Lev Vygotsky. So in Vygotsky's view, language helps with the transmission of culture from one generation to the next. So it helps adults to share their beliefs and their thoughts and traditions, and that is one of the ways that his sociocultural perspective persists. However, he also studied children's inner speech and how inner speech can be used to help with difficult tasks, with decision making, to guide your own behavior, to help with self-restraint. So Vygotsky had a lot to say about language as well. Now, those are not the only theories out there looking at language. We're going to start with this idea of nature versus nurture. I'm sure you recall this from your intro psychology course. Nature is looking at the biological or genetic underpinnings of a behavior. Nurture is looking at the environmental underpinnings. So let's start with nature. What are we born with? What genetic predispositions do we have that help us with the acquisition of language? Well, first, and most language theorists do agree that there is quite a considerable genetic component to language. One of the ways that we know this is if you look at children worldwide, children reach language milestones at approximately the same time and approximately in the same order. So you start to see the one-word utterances, then the two-word utterances, all these things occur not only again in the same order, but in a similar time frame across the globe. So that tells us there's something biological there because there's so many environmental differences across the globe. So it must be biological. Some other things that we know. Infants have a preference for human voices. Now, even more specifically than that, they have a preference for the voices of their biological mother and any caregivers that might have been around while they were in the womb. They're actually able to hear some voices while they're in the womb. And so at birth, they do have a preference for those voices. And they have a preference for human voices over other animals or other types of sounds. They also have the ability to differentiate between, now that doesn't mean make, but differentiate so they can understand subtle differences in speech sounds. And researchers believe that it is these biological underpinnings that make children capable of learning language so quickly. Continuing with nature, we also know that there are parts of the brain that are specifically related to different aspects of language. So the left hemisphere is considered to be the hemisphere of your brain that has more control over language processing. We also know there's a specific area of the brain called Broca's area, And Broca's area helps us with the production of speech, okay, with forming and making the sounds necessary to correctly enunciate the words. Here's a short video talking a little bit about Broca's area.
Welcome to 2-Minute Neuroscience, where I explain neuroscience topics in 2 minutes or less. In this installment, I'll discuss Broca's area. Although the anatomical definitions of Broca's area are not completely consistent, it is generally considered to make up some part of a region called the inferior frontal gyrus, which is found in the frontal lobe. In the vast majority of individuals, Broca's area resides in the left cerebral hemisphere. Broca's area was named for the physician Paul Broca, who first identified the region as playing a potentially important role in speech production. Broca based this hypothesis on case studies of patients who had damage to the area and also displayed a deficit of speech. The particular condition Broca observed came to be known as Broca's aphasia and involves a deficit in the ability to produce language. In patients with Broca's aphasia, reading and writing are also often impaired, but language comprehension is typically relatively preserved. The precise role of Broca's area in language production, however, is still being debated. In other words, damage to Broca's area can disrupt language production, but nobody is quite sure exactly what language-related function is lost to cause that disruption. Some have hypothesized Broca's area is involved with producing movements, like of the tongue and mouth, that allow speech to be produced. Others have argued it is involved with syntax, grammar, verbal working memory, or all of the above.
So, with Broca's area, we know that the individual is able to understand, they're just not able to form the words correctly. And Paul Broca, they didn't mention this in the video, he actually discovered this while performing an autopsy of a patient who suffered with a brain injury. And after that brain injury, he was only able to say the word tan. And that was the area of the brain that was damaged that he discovered in that particular autopsy. So we do think it has to do something with the motor controls in the brain that help with speech development. Here's a video of a girl who has had damage to that area of her brain, so you can see how this might manifest, this type of aphasia.
Scott. Oh, no. Sarah Scott.
That's right. And how old are you?
I can't.
Try.
I can't.
You're 19. 19. Yeah. And what happened to you?
Stroke. School. And English class.
Okay.
And I book, and I read it aloud, but I can't because stroke.
And what happened after the stroke with your speech?
But I can't.
What do you do now? Every day?
Oh, speech, then the speech.
I'd like to point out that Sarah Scott in that video, you can actually see updates from the therapy that she used, and her speech did improve over time. Okay, so that's Broca's area. Another area of the brain connected to language is called Wernicke's area. Wernicke's area has to do with comprehension. So again, these two are kind of opposite. Broca's, you can understand, you just can't speak it. It doesn't come out the way you want it to. Wernicke's area, you have a hard time understanding it.
Wernicke's aphasia is a communication disorder that affects a person's ability to understand words. It comes on suddenly, the result of a brain injury or stroke. People with Wernicke's aphasia can speak easily, but the words don't always make sense. Their understanding of speech is impaired, so their answers may not match the question. People with Wernicke's aphasia may not know that they're adding non-existent words into their sentences, and may grow confused when other people don't understand them. It is very difficult for them to follow a conversation or comprehend language, written or spoken. Wernicke's aphasia, like all forms of aphasia, is treated with speech therapy. If you're speaking with someone who has Wernicke's aphasia, Pay attention to your surroundings and try to figure out meaning from contextual clues. Slow the pace of your speech and give information in chunks. Use gestures or pictures if possible. Repeat and rephrase information, pausing to make sure your words are understood. Most of all, be patient and keep the conversation direct and easy to follow.
And I think it's nice that they also provided some tips in that video. So again, with Wernicke, it was discovered by Carl Wernicke. He had 2 patients who were fluent. They could speak fluently, like you could tell in the previous video with Sarah Scott, she couldn't get the words out. These patients could talk, their words just didn't make much sense. And again, he discovered that the damage to their brain was in the area where we now call Wernicke's area. Okay, so continuing with this idea of the influence of nature or biology on language acquisition, language development. We also know that we have sensitive periods, is what we call them, or built-in time frames for learning language. Now, one of the ways that we know that is through sometimes case studies such as Jeannie. So this is a very heartbreaking study. So Jeannie was 13 years old when she was discovered. She, up until that point in her life, had been subject to incredible abuse and neglect. She had been locked in her bedroom and was completely isolated. So she had not had conversations with people. She didn't go to school. She didn't have friends. She was literally locked in her bedroom for 13 years. Her parents never spoke to her. They provided food, I believe, under the door. She appeared at the age of 13 when they discovered her to be entirely without language. Now, researchers who wanted to help her also felt that this was an ideal opportunity to test the theory that if she was provided with a nurturing environment, it might make up for the previous neglect and abuse. That if they got her at 17 and they provided her with a rich, nourishing environment and helped her, that they could compensate for that loss. But after years of intense language and other types of rehabilitation, she was still unable to completely acquire language. She could only speak in very short, garbled, and mangled sentences. That is used as well as other research, is used to indicate that there are certain sensitive periods that if early in life you don't get what you need to acquire language, you might miss that opportunity and never fully develop language. All right, so that's nature. Now let's take a look at nurture. So for this one, I included a clip art of the home to indicate. So nurture is about the world in which you live, your parents' parenting styles, your relationship with your siblings, the schools you attend, the educational resources you have, and so on. So one of the big facts that we know that tells us that the world around us affects our acquisition of language is that children develop language more quickly when they're exposed to a variety of language and complexity of language. In fact, the greater number of words and the greater complexity of words that they hear, the faster their own vocabulary develops. So although, yes, initially when the child is learning some of those first 1 and 2 word utterances, you want to be very simple and concrete with your language. But once they've reached that language explosion, you really want to provide them with rich examples of language. Not too much baby talk, shall we say. And we've also found that children don't just absorb the language. They don't just hear it and repeat it. They are still constructing meanings and creating their own understandings of language. Here's some research I found to exemplify this previous point. So it's showing that the greater proportion of complex syntax that the child heard, the greater his ability to use it. So here at the bottom, this axis is showing the amount of complexity of sentences that they hear from the mom. And on this axis, you hear the amount of complexity provided by the children. This scatter plot is showing a positive, well, I guess my video is reversed, so go this way. Okay, a positive correlation. The more complex words they hear, the more complex words they can produce. What else do we know? Like I said before, rather than simply absorbing that language, children are constructing their own meanings. This goes very well with the things that we studied within the world of constructivism. We aren't just parrots repeating what we've heard, we're creating our own understandings. So I thought this was kind of cute and related. I find the easiest way to expand my vocabulary is to make up words. Okay, well, not necessarily, but kids do make up their own understandings. So continuing with environment, research has also shown that language can differ based upon socioeconomic status. Socioeconomic status is something that we have already looked at in this class. Recall that socioeconomic status is more than just the amount of family income. It's also looking at the education level and occupational level of one's parents. So what data do we have to support this statement? Studies have found that parents from middle-income households tend to talk to their children about twice as much as parents from lower-income households. That's a pretty staggering statistic. Not necessarily for notes, but just some added detail. The actual numbers, children in middle-class homes heard over 2,000 words an hour. Children in lower-income homes heard only about 600 words per hour. Some of the landmark research in this area came from a study called the 30 million word gap. It's a bit older. It is, really the initial study's from 1995, but it was quite a large and important study. And here's some of the research that they found, looking at the number of words heard in children across different income groups. And then they were looking at, if you look at that exponentially across time, how that does become something like a $30 million word gap, and how that is something that is difficult for children to overcome within the area of language acquisition. Okay, here's going to be where we pause for the end of part 1 on language. When we come back for part 2, we're going to be looking at the development of language as well as language diversity. So thank you for your attention.